Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. My name is Rupert Reed. I'm the chair of Greenhouse. Greenhouse is one of the three organisations behind today's event. We've sort of put the boots on the ground with that part of it. We're also a think tank, as you may be aware. Do find out all about us if you don't know about us by going online. I'm now going to move to our first panellist. We're going to go in a slightly different order to what we have on your schedules. Molly is going to go first, and then the order will be as it is on your schedule. So I'm pleased to introduce my colleague in Greenhouse, Professor Molly Scott Cato, author of several important books, including most lately The Bioregional Economy. She's now at Roehampton University, and here she is, Molly.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by saying something about science. On Monday, got up listening to the Today programme, as ever, and I was listening to Evan Davis interviewing Fisheries Minister Richard Beyong. He was talking about his decision to oppose the latest EU fisheries proposal, which Beyong claimed he was doing on scientific grounds. Davies brought in the top fisheries scientist from DEFRA, who argued for the EU proposal. And the point I want to make is the interest I found in the fact that Evan Davis seemed genuinely perplexed by the ability of scientists to disagree. He was seeking a right answer that was scientifically proved and unassailable. Years ago, I put together a report called I Don't Know Much About Science, But I Know What I Like. It's Martin Amos's joke, but I've always enjoyed it. The reason I enjoy it is that it achieves with wit and brevity the task of challenging the right of science, usually in this context meaning statistical evidence, to trump other forms of thought. Caroline Lucas, couldn't have a meeting without mentioning her, Caroline Lucas has said that we're going to be the first species that is able to scientifically monitor our own extinction. Consecutive reports from the IPCC suggest that she's right about this, but I'm a bit more optimistic myself. And my optimism organises itself under my latest personal mantra, join the evolution. Now, this is how join the evolution works. We, as the human species, are unique in being a self-conscious animal. When other animals receive indications that they're reaching the limits of their evolutionary niche, they respond to these by finding a new niche, or by failing to reproduce, or otherwise by ensuring that their numbers decline. But as humans, we're much too clever for that. We can use our clever minds and our technology to keep pushing the boundary outwards, ignoring and filtering out the clear evidence that the ecological safety limits have been breached. So as a self-conscious animal, we need to evolve self-consciously. We need to find a way to get a collective grip on ourselves, to stop believing our own fantasies, to get back down to earth. And that's what I mean by joining the evolution. And I would argue it's something like that, a desire to do something like that, that's brought you here today. So I've got nothing against science, I've got to say that because I know what Brian's going to do in a minute. And I think being able to prove that resources are not limitless and have some idea of the scope of the problem we're facing is vitally important in convincing those trapped in the scientific mindset. But it's not going to save us. We need much more human solutions to do that. So the rest of what I'm going to say, I've been rather miserly. The chair's been a bit miserly. I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to race through as much as I can before he shuts me up. So in the next section, I think a bit about how that might work, and then I think a little bit about political economy. So the next bit's called Who Do We Think We Are? My contention here is that our consumption behaviour has social rather than economic motivations. And this is an idea I develop in my book, and I draw on the work of the institutionalist economist Thorsten Veblen. So Veblen posited that consumption was not motivated by a desire to subsist, but rather as a means of establishing social status. So here's a quotation. The end of acquisition and accumulation is conventionally held to be the consumption of the goods accumulated. But it is only when taken in a sense far removed from its naive meaning that consumption of goods can be said to afford the incentive from which accumulation invariably proceeds. Veblen's conclusion was that the motive that lies at the root of ownership is emulation. So his notion of pecuniary emulation challenges the conventional economic account of a struggle for subsistence within an overarching framework of scarcity. In more marginal economies, subsistence clearly is still a motivation, but it's rapidly replaced as we grow, in fact, by a desire to advertise our ability to consume and hence to establish our superiority. Veblen's conception of consumption as related to the establishment of status rather than the meeting of need is actually a very important and a very encouraging insight, because it suggests that our task in ensuring that patterns of consumption fit within planetary limits does not necessitate what often seems to be an impossible aim, that is, focusing directly on the objects of desire with which people surround themselves in our modern society. Electronic gadgets, home furnishings, wonderful clothing, and so on. These things that people have come to regard as their birthright. But actually our focus should be on shifting the basis on which social status is established. So carrying on the tradition of Veblen, Geoffrey Hodgson wrote in 2003, exploring the role of habit formation in the field of consumption behaviour. He argued that the standard model of the utility maximising agent that's central to economic theory actually omits the important element of our economic activity that arises from learned behaviour and, crucially, can be changed through social action. So here's Geoffrey Hodgson now. Beliefs may change, not simply as a result of receiving information, but also because habitual mechanisms of interpretation may alter. In contrast to the pervasive idea of the given individual, the individual is formed and reconstituted in an ongoing process. Institutions matter in both cases. But in the habit-based conception, they can also lead eventually to new habits and new preferences or beliefs. So the emphasis on consumption taking place within the context of social institutions and being responsive to changes in the norms of those institutions, as well as in response to change in information, suggests an important role for cultural leadership, particularly from educators and politicians, in setting the parameters within which consumption can form part of a sustainable society. I just want to mention, sorry, Ray says I'm not speaking loud enough. This is a big ask to speak louder, Ray. This is a distinct cause from the behaviour change that is now so fashionable, sort of nudge-type politics. This actually requires genuine engagement and leadership rather than subtle attempts to manipulate behaviour through incentives. I always talk about Stroud, where I live, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing that now, and talk a little bit about my home community, Stroud, and its inhabitants, the Stroudies, because I think we're a community actually demonstrating such leadership. What is a Stroudie, you might be asking? I think our first major achievement as a town of only 15,000 people is that we feature in encyclopedias at all. So one encyclopedia explains a Stroudie as follows. There is a stereotype of the Green Party supporting Stroudie, generally opposed to genetically modified produce, oil companies and fast food chains. Stroud was one of the birthplaces of the organic food movement and was home to Britain's first organic cafe. We are a bit of a stereotype. Typical characteristics of the Stroudy are listed as including reading cider with Rosie by Aurélie, walking up the steep Spillman's pitch with bags of shopping, regularly seen, Morris dancing around the maypole whilst watching the sunrise on Painswick Beacon, campaigning to bring back Stroud Time, which is about 9 minutes later than GMT, wearing handmade clothes and buying organic fair trade produce, and doing some sort of art or creative expression. I would add to this the ability to demonstrate 3 different skills, at least one of which is connected with music. So, the reason I bring this up, aside from my local patriotism, is that we need something. It's very important that we find something to replace the consumption-based identities that dominate the lives of most citizens and are closely tied up with economic growth. And I believe that in Stroud we've found something, and as some of the quotations I've read demonstrate, it's something that already demonstrates self-conscious responsibility for the planet. So the last little bit is called Why Can't We Stop? A very important question for us. So there are many myths that keep us on the growth and consumption treadmill, even though we know we're killing our planet and making ourselves and those we love unhappy. The most powerful is the newly globalised American dream. As the Occupy protesters said, they call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. And it's really time we all woke up. In fact, I think a lot of people have woken up. For the first time, surveys are showing that the majority of Americans do not believe that things will be better for their children, and they mean better in material terms. They've lost faith in the American way of life to generate better. Of course, we didn't invent these myths to live by. They were invented self-consciously and with, I would argue, fairly socially benign intent by the advertising industry. A controversial point there. You might question my suggestion that there was social motivation at the heart of the advertising industry, but I think there was, and that's something, again, that I argue in my book. Because the tendency amongst environmentalists is to critique the consumerist culture as though it was only designed to increase the profits of corporations. But I'm not sure that's helpful in moving us on from the growth-based economy. And personally, I think it's more useful to understand how the horror of the 1930s, the last time capitalism experienced a really serious crisis of economic demand, actually forced genuinely well-meaning people to find ways to overstimulate demand to avoid the economic crisis. So, while Keynes is often credited with solving the problems of the 1930s, in fact, I would argue that there was a strong role for Freud as well. The Freudian concept I've got in mind is that of cathexis. Cathexis is defined as the concentration of mental energy on one particular person, idea, or object, especially to an unhealthy degree. I think this concept can support a critique of the way the consumerist culture focuses on selling objects, apparently to satisfy a certain need, when really they satisfy a deeper and perhaps even subliminal desire. Beautiful women draped over fast cars persuade young men that they will acquire sexual allure as well as a set of wheels. In this way, our desires and needs are themselves distorted, ultimately leading us towards lives of dissatisfaction and longing. It seems to me that excelling in this process was at the heart of what is widely called the genius of Steve Jobs. Here's a quotation. There were some fantastic obituaries of Steve Jobs. And here's one from Julian Bergini in The Guardian. Jobs' success was built firmly on the idea that you should not give consumers what they want because they don't know what they want. No one thought that they wanted the first desktop, Mac, iPod, iPhone, or iPad before they existed. Jobs repeatedly created things that people came to want more than anything else, only by not trying to give them what they already wanted. And Rupert's telling me to shut up, but I also want to mention the way you've got to stroke all those objects. I resisted the iPad for a long time because I didn't want to have to stroke a piece of machinery. There seems to be something interesting but also unhealthy there. So, I don't have time to answer the question of how to shift people's search for identity away from the gadget, but it seems to me a useful place to start, to realise that the consumption identity developed to provide an infinite stimulus for economic demand can only lead to dissatisfaction. That is, in fact, the point of it. Its purpose is to make us dissatisfied so that we demand more, because if we were satisfied, we'd stop shopping. But what I can tell you, I can't answer that question, but what I can tell you from my personal experience is that, in contrast to that kind of identity, the human scale, locally rooted Stroudy identity is satisfying, if only the economy would allow me adequate time to enjoy it. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly. I think that's a splendid, mind-broadening way of launching us on this afternoon's topic. I particularly enjoyed the concept of individuals as reconstituted, which makes individuals sound like some kind of ghastly meat substitute or something, which I think is really good because it counters the constant propaganda in favour of individualism in our society. So thanks particularly for that. Molly and I, as some of you will be aware and some of you won't, are both lead candidates for the Green Party for the European elections. We're trying to get to Brussels.